So I want to welcome you this morning, and I want to thank you for attending. For those who don't know, I'm Maya Van Rossum. I'm the Delaware Riverkeeper and leader of the four-state organization, the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. I am proud to be here this morning to share with you a new report that the Delaware Riverkeeper Network is releasing. I'm going to give you a little bit of upfront information about the report. We're going to hear from two of our experts that authored the report, and then we're going to put it in a little bit of context, and then we'll get to your question. But in short, this report spotlights the enormous economic benefits that could result from a cleaner Delaware River and improved dissolved oxygen levels in the Delaware River estuary. The report is titled Economic Value of Dissolved Oxygen Restoration in the Delaware River Estuary. You know, every year around this time, coming into the spring, as people are turning back to the river, we all hear the comeback story of the Delaware River. And we hear about how not too long ago in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the Delaware River, the Delaware Estuary was so polluted that it was marred by a 20-mile oxygen dead zone that the fish couldn't get past, and was the result of and emblematic of the high levels of pollution and contamination that were allowed to be dumped into our beautiful Delaware River. And then, of course, as the story goes, we hear about how laws were passed and agencies were formed like the Delaware River Basin Commission. And there was a lot of community engagement and a lot of hard work and a lot of efforts to clean up the Delaware River and to restore it to healthy life. And then, as the story rightly goes, the oxygen levels started to come back as the pollution declined, and the fish started to come back, including, of course, the ecologically and economically important and very emblematic Delaware River shad population. But the problem is, while we had this dramatic success that we hear about in that powerful story, the problem is that we haven't finished the job. We accomplished a lot, and then we've sort of stagnated. And so at this point, all of those self-congratulations that we hear from agencies and others based on this story of history are really starting to fall flat. You can only congratulate yourself for so long if you haven't fully completed the job. While we no longer have an oxygen dead zone every summer, an oxygen dead zone, you know, in the Delaware Estuary, in the Camden, Philadelphia reach of the river, every summer, despite the improvements that we have seen, we do still have problems with dissolved oxygen in that 20-mile zone. We have a 20-mile zone of hypoxia, or depressed dissolved oxygen levels, which reappears from Philadelphia down to the Delaware state line, impairing the estuarine ecosystem and doing direct damage to species such as the federally endangered Atlantic sturgeon that live in the Delaware River. And I want to note that the Delaware River population of Atlantic sturgeon is genetically unique. It is only found in our beautiful Delaware River. And at this point, we have less than 300 spawning adults left. That is one of the reasons why it is identified as endangered, because it is very literally on the cusp of extinction. And at this point, you know, the truth is that the regulatory agencies who were among the key advocates and leaders in helping to support and advance that original restoration of dissolved oxygen to the estuary that brought us to an important point of return, but not all the way when it comes to health and fish populations. At this point, they're really falling down on the job. And in many instances, too many instances, we see agency leaders joining with industry to urge slow action or no action to fully restore water quality and dissolved oxygen levels and health to the Delaware River estuary. Often the argument they use for why we can't continue to make progress is that it's going to cost too much for the dischargers and for industry to properly restore health to our beautiful Delaware River. Well, we at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and our 16 coalition partners that I'm going to talk about after we hear from our experts, we don't subscribe to that way of thinking, nor does the Federal Clean Water Act, which we believe legally requires ongoing improvement. So at this point, we're going to have some presentations about this powerful new report. I'm then going to put it into context to talk about how advocates are using this report to really spur action and change. And just want to note that while the law requires restoration, morally, we need to continue with restoration. The people and the communities of the Delaware Estuary region deserve restoration. And while it cannot be and should not be about the money, that it really needs to be about the health and the safety of our river and our communities. It needs to be about protecting the aquatic life and the natural resources that deserve our respect and protection. It needs to be about honoring our obligation to future generations to protect the river for their benefit too. The truth is that even when you look at it economically, when you look at it from that money perspective, there is immense value in river restoration, including restoration of the dissolved oxygen levels in the Delaware Estuary. And so with that, I'm going to turn the podium, so to speak, over to our senior scientist at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, Eric Sildorf, who has been leading this important research project. Eric?
Thank you, Maya. And I think that's a great introduction, and it'll actually save me some time, and so I don't have to reintroduce some of those main key points that Maya's talked about. I do want to emphasize and take that baton about the deliberations since 1967, because these regulatory agencies literally have focused for the last 50 years on that price, that cost of upgrades to these wastewater treatment plants. But a key missing element for those earlier deliberations was the failure to quantify and the failure to articulate the cost of inaction. That is, the price for deferring decisions yet again, and the economic benefits to our communities that are lost year after year and decade after decade by continuing to pollute our rivers and streams and forego the benefits of clean water. And this, of course, is above and beyond just the ecological benefits, which are not entirely captured or estimable in economic currencies. Our research that we present here today seeks to fill that gap and quantify the economic benefits of dissolved oxygen restoration here in the Delaware Estuary. Let me use a couple of slides to illustrate this history, the problems, and our research into the future solutions. So hold on a sec while I try to bring up just a couple of slides to illustrate this problem. Again, as Maya emphasized, it is no exaggeration to say that this was a dead ecosystem even just 50 years ago, around the time of the Clean Water Act. A lack of oxygen, known as hypoxia, covered an area of over 40 miles of the 133-mile-long Delaware Estuary. That is about 1/3 of the length of this estuarine ecosystem suffered from insufficient oxygen, including areas in red, which were true dead zones without oxygen for up to 5 months every year. The research report we've just released in collaboration with Key Log Economics looks at the forecast benefits from implementing the long overdue NBOD load reductions in the Delaware Estuary. And the success in bringing American shad and striped bass and other species back to this estuary. All of this, again, as Maya articulated, began in the 1950s and 1960s and was codified in the 1967 Water Quality Standards and in the 1968 waste load allocation, essentially a pollution diet for the estuary that was put in place by the then radically new interstate agency called the Delaware River Basin Commission. This table summarizes the aspirations of that time period, but also what was left unfinished. There's a lot of detail, and I could spend a lot of time on this slide. Instead of going into all of that detail, I'll refer you to the report or take any questions that you have about this. The broad summary is that DRBC chose to only partially address the dissolved oxygen problem back in 1967 and 1968. Just as importantly, those decisions remain in place over 50 years later and are the ruling regulatory standards even today in 2021. What the table tells us is that the carbon fraction of the waste, known as CBOD, was the larger and the easier of the two wastes to address, and so major load reductions were required in the 1968 waste load allocation for CBOD. This was tremendously important and began the process of plant upgrades that allowed life to return to our urban corridor of the estuary. But the other fraction of the waste, the nitrogen fraction, or NBOD, was deferred to a later time. And here in 2021, the NBOD wastes remain unregulated. And all studies of the estuary in the last 40 years have emphasized that these NBOD wastes are the primary driver of our contemporary dissolved oxygen problems. And let me emphasize, as Maya did, although many chose to look the other way, we do still have dissolved oxygen problems here in the tidal Delaware River. Both in 2019 and 2020, we had really bad summers for dissolved oxygen. And in 2020, a water quality sensor in Chester, Pennsylvania, recorded dissolved oxygen down to 2.8 milligrams per liter. And a similar sensor at the Ben Franklin Bridge recorded DO down to 3.3 milligrams per liter. These are lethal levels for many fish and other aquatic life, and only half the concentration recommended by DRBC's own study of oxygen requirements protects species here in the Delaware estuary. This brings me to my third and final slide. Again, the research report we've just released in collaboration with Keylog Economics looks at the forecast benefits from implementing the long overdue NBOD load reductions in the Delaware estuary. Our analyses used past research, current estimates of NBOD loading, and forecast reductions in that NBOD loading to estimate the improvements to dissolved oxygen and some of the improvements to the ecosystem health. My colleague and co-author, Carolyn, will talk about the translation of those to economic valuations, but I wanted to highlight at least one graph from the report that portrays the complex temporal and spatial variation in dissolved oxygen under both current conditions and the forecast moderate restoration scenario that is the focus of the report. In this graph, we show the typical dissolved oxygen conditions for points along the estuary. Typical meaning a median dissolved oxygen concentration, a median for the summer months, the warm summer months of June, July, and August. Give you a quick little orientation on the graph. Along the x-axis are river miles up from the Atlantic Ocean, with Trenton at river mile 133, which is the head of tide, the Ben Franklin Bridge that I mentioned before in the middle of DRBC's Zone 3, where the Ben Franklin sensor for dissolved oxygen is, and then the Delaware, Pennsylvania state line at river mile 78.8. And then on the y-axis are our dissolved oxygen concentration. The yellow curve shows the DO sag that currently occurs every year in the estuary. And note that this does not represent the extreme events like we saw in 2020, with oxygen down all the way to 2.8 milligrams per liter at Chester at river mile 83. This graph also shows the 6.3 milligram per liter recommendation from the DRBC Commission report on the oxygen requirements for species here in the Delaware estuary. The blue curve then shows the forecast median summer dissolved oxygen concentrations with those NBOD load reductions put in place, as has been talked about since 1967. As can be seen in this summary graph, dissolved oxygen conditions are forecast to increase by between 1 and 2 milligrams per liter for the critical zones of the Delaware estuary. Just as importantly, with investments in clean water, we will maintain dissolved oxygen at or above the requisite 6.3 milligrams per liter threshold for protecting all aquatic life in the estuary, including the endangered Atlantic sturgeon. These water quality improvements are enormously important for the ecology of this ecosystem, but they are also important for the communities living and recreating along the river. Let me then turn the presentation over to my colleague and co-author, Carolyn Alcar, to talk about how these water quality changes were used in the economic modeling. Carolyn?
All right. Give me a minute here.
Just while Carolyn's doing that, just want to highlight for folks, while, as Eric said, the 6.3 milligrams per liter is what's been identified as important for aquatic life to propagate, live, and thrive. The standard is down at the 3.5 milligrams per liter level currently. There we go. Got it, Carolyn.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for hanging in there with me here. For the economic analysis, we assessed the potential effects of improved dissolved oxygen levels in the Delaware estuary, both qualitatively and quantitatively. Data were available to estimate potential benefits for fisheries, recreational activities, and property values within the estuary. So for commercial fisheries, we modeled the increase in juvenile survival rates with forecast improvements in dissolved oxygen levels, which Eric referenced in his last slide. And to estimate the potential rise in commercial fish landings in the estuary, for commercial fishing increases. Our starting point was the average annual commercial landings for commercial shad, striped bass, and white perch within the estuary from 2000 to 2018. And so for the three species that we could model changes in juvenile survival rates with improvements in dissolved oxygen, we estimated the value of landings within the estuary could increase about 728 million annually, depending of course on harvest levels and the dissolved oxygen distribution considered. So quantifying recreational fishing benefits, we relied on previous studies in the region, which through angler surveys estimated the increase in the value per fishing trip with an increase in the expected catch rate due to improvements in water quality. So we focus here on the number of fishing trips in the estuary, during which the study species were identified as the fish that the anglers were targeting in their trip, resulting in estimated benefits of 5.8 million annually for an average of one additional fish caught per fishing trip. The other recreational uses use results of previous studies in nearby areas, which estimated the monetary value of water quality improvements for boating and for other shoreline activities such as walking or wildlife watching to both participants and non-participants. We estimated the benefits to residents of the estuary study region, and that's the people that are within 2 miles of the Delaware River. The river-related recreation benefits are over 7 million annually, and that is including about 3.5 million a year for shoreline activities along the Delaware River and 4 million for boating. To estimate the property value effects, we estimated the property value increases in subzones with dissolved oxygen level increases greater than 1 milligrams per liter. The potential property value increases are based on the number of housing units within each subzone on the map that Eric showed earlier, the median housing value, and the sale price increases that are associated with dissolved oxygen improvements for urban and also less urban areas, and we obtained these from previous research. We found that dissolved oxygen improvements could stimulate a one-time increase in property values ranging from from 541 to 835 million, depending on the dissolved oxygen distribution, or 32 to 48 million annually based on the average number of years owners reside in their homes. So to conclude, let me quit this. To conclude, our analysis represents a conservative estimate of the overall economic benefits and shows that dissolved oxygen improvements would lead to significant benefits for fish fisheries and other uses of the estuary. So I'd like to turn it back now to Maya.
So thank you so much for that, Carolyn. Just really quickly to show one of the reasons why we did this analysis and how we're putting it into action is the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and a coalition of organizations. At this point, there are 16 organizations that have signed on, but amongst our key partners are Environment New Jersey, Clean Air Council, Penn Future. We submitted earlier in March a petition to the Delaware River Basin Commission urging them to recognize that fish propagation is taking place in the Delaware Estuary and that water quality upgrades, including an upgrade of the dissolved oxygen standard, is necessary in order to protect the aquatic life of the Delaware Estuary. As I noted earlier, the current dissolved oxygen standard is that 50-plus-year-old standard of 3.5 milligrams per liter. As Dr. Sildorf made clear, that even DRBC's own research shows that we need to be looking at 6.3 milligrams per liter. So in this petition, that is what we are asking for. We are asking for the DRBC to recognize what is happening with aquatic life in the estuary and then improve the water quality standards, including the dissolved oxygen standards, to fully and fairly support that current use. That petition was actually submitted on March 3rd of 2021. In fact, the first time the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, along with the Delaware River Shad Fishermen's Association and the Lehigh River Stocking Association, put in this kind of request in a petition format was all the way back in 2013. And at that time, the Delaware River Basin Commission considered it, and their reaction was more study is necessary to decide what is happening with aquatic life in the estuary, what is happening with dissolved oxygen standards, and to decide whether or not something needs to be done to address the depressed oxygen levels that Dr. Sildorf spoke about. All of that additional study that the DRBC called for has done nothing but confirm that fish propagation is taking place in the estuary, that fish propagation is not a recognized use by the DRBC and the states of the DRBC, and that as a result of the Clean Water Act, that existing use does in fact need to be recognized, and water quality standards in response need to be improved. So they called for more study, they got more study, and that more study says that it's time to take action. And as this analysis has demonstrated, now I want to say again, they called for more study, but also during this time, the Delaware River Basin Commission and other agencies have really joined with industry to claim that it would be too expensive to put in place the higher standards necessary for fully and fairly protecting aquatic life. And so we at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network commissioned this report, advanced this report to prove the point that inaction is too costly. It is too costly for the communities of the Delaware River estuary. It is too costly for the health of our beautiful Delaware River, and it is too costly economically. Across the board, it is time for the DRBC to act to improve water quality standards and dissolved oxygen levels in the Delaware estuary. So with that, we are going to open it up to questions. And while you're thinking of those questions, I just want to pose one question to Dr. Sildorf so he can highlight a critical aspect of this report that hasn't come out yet. Dr. Sildorf, can you talk a little bit about the environmental justice implications of what we found as a result of our analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. And Carolyn or Sonia might want to weigh in on that. But part of the modeling here was a spatially explicit modeling of the improvements to dissolved oxygen for each of the communities along the river so that we could actually look at the specific benefits to those communities that are adjacent to the different areas of the Delaware River. And by doing that, Sonia and Carolyn were able to model the property value increases for individual tracts. So parts of Camden, parts of Chester in particular, parts of Wilmington, then of course, all of the different communities around Philadelphia. I don't know if Sonia or Carolyn, you want to talk more about that, but that was actually a key part of one of the innovative parts of our study was that ability not to just say broad brush for the Philly metro area, but to talk explicitly about areas that have had to suffer from this, really injustice. If this were in other places, if this were in the Chesapeake Bay, it wouldn't have taken 50 years to upgrade the standards and to set new targets. But partly because these are poor areas, industrial areas, nobody is clamoring for upgrades right away.
Carolyn?
And we were also able to conduct some interviews with organizations along the river just to ask and get a sense of, what the community values in terms of environmental amenities, what are the challenges? And I think across the board, a lot of it is just addressing these root economic issues that are depressing property values, keeping people in poverty. And across the board, every person we interviewed, every organization we interviewed said that having environmental uplifts like dissolved oxygen restoration and subsequently water quality improvements would make these areas better off and would help the community.
So just wondering if any of the reporters on the line, if you want to do a physical hand raise or an electronic hand raise, if you have any questions, we'd like to open the floor for that. And Jill, if you can put the questions we received by email in the chat so I can pepper them in as well.
Hi Maya and Eric, excuse me. So can you talk about how this reduction in NBOD would be achieved? I mean, what do wastewater treatment plants have to do in order to restore the DO level, and how much is that going to cost them? I mean, if DRBC has been saying for a long time that it's going to be too expensive, well, I mean, have you quantified how how much money that would be and how it would be paid for?
Yeah, so the really key point about this is that the type of treatment we're talking about is conventional technology. Any treatment plant that is built right now in 2021 has that, and probably for the last 20 to 30 years, any wastewater treatment plant that is built in with a specific function called nitrification, that they take the reduced forms of nitrogen, basically a lot of ammonia, right, coming into the waste, and they let microbes chew on that ammonia and convert it to nitrate. It's not radical technology. It's not nutrient removal, which may be warranted at some point in time. It really is conventional technology. And in fact, actually, a lot of the smaller plants along the estuary, as part of their standard upgrades, because it is so conventional, have actually implemented nitrification as part of it. It's the big wastewater treatment plants. It's the 3 Philly plants. It's the Camden County, the Gloucester County, and the city of Wilmington in particular, and then a few of the smaller to medium plants, but not all of them, that have said, well, we're not required to do it. We're not going to, put that in. And so it is conventional technology. DRC has come out with a recent study to look at the individual costs for the main wastewater treatment plants. It's on the order of the kind of benefits that we're talking about. There's capital costs, there's O&M costs. We think that some of the O&M costs are slightly exaggerated. There are comments from US EPA on the draft report from DRBC saying that the rate of inflation to spread out those costs over 5 years is exaggerated. So we think that the DRBC report is generally good and lays out the capital costs appropriately, but perhaps inflates the cost by kind of increasing the interest rate on the loans that people would have to take. But it's on the order of 50 to 100 million for some of the bigger wastewater treatment plants to implement this technology. But again,
that's a one-time cost, is it?
That's right. So there's the one-time cost, the capital. So basically you have to have tanks and you have to bubble in oxygen, right? These are aerobic microbes that just take, pretty high demand of oxygen in order to convert that ammonia to nitrate. And the whole idea there is let's use the oxygen in a wastewater treatment plant rather than use up all the oxygen in the estuary that the sturgeon need to breathe and the striped bass and the shad and things like that, right? So there is a one-time capital cost to make sure that they have the tankage and they have blowers in place. And then there are, of course, staffing and supplies and, the energy to run those blowers and things like that, the long term. But it is, it's a really good question because it is conventional technology. And back in the 1960s, he said, well, the CBOD is easier to treat. It wasn't as conventional. It was NBOD treatment. Nitrification was considered a little bit of a nuisance problem, but easily by the 1980s and 1990s, it was just standard treatment. But because it wasn't required, basically, the amount of nitrogen coming into amount of ammonia coming into these wastewater treatment plants is basically the same as what is leaving the plants. There's almost no treatment. 70 to 90% of the nitrogen that is discharged from the ones that haven't implemented nitrification is coming out as NBOD or as ammonia. So very little treatment for something that could be very easily be done. And any wastewater treatment plant engineer with a bachelor's degree has studied nitrification and knows, it's simple technology.
So
and are you proposing sources of finance for this? I mean, $50 to $100 million for each wastewater treatment plant. I mean, that's not chump change, is it?
It isn't chump change. They're just a recent $100 million investment by the city of Philadelphia to upgrade their Northeast wastewater treatment plant to deal with some of the raw sewage overflows that come from that facility, because the antiquated infrastructure, the fact that they have combined sewer pipes rather than separate sewer pipes. So this is on the order of the standard types of loans that the city of Philadelphia and these other municipal authorities are already taking out for investments in their wastewater treatment plant. So yeah, there's known funding mechanisms that involves both grants and loans. And then particularly in environmental justice communities, a lot of those loans can be forgiven rather than have to pay back in their entirety. So there are funding mechanisms to do this, and particularly in some of these areas that we're talking about, it's a pretty straightforward process.
So you guys are saying that the DRBC should be requiring the wastewater treatment plants to implement this technology?
So John, what we're doing is we're saying that the DRBC is legally obligated and the member states are legally obligated to recognize the existing uses happening in the estuary, including that fish are reproducing there, and upgrade the dissolved oxygen standards. The how that happens becomes a second question, and it is a natural outgrowth of that, but they're legally obliged to protect the water quality, and then that becomes a step two, and in very significant part depends upon the industries themselves and the dischargers themselves that are using our estuary as their wastewater bucket. But we're going to take a question from Michael, and then Frank, I know you have a question as well. So Michael.
Sure, thanks, Maya. You mentioned, and you just brought it up there again, that one of the key things you want is for the DRBC to recognize fish propagation as a primary use of the river. I'm curious as to why that's not inherently recognized, right? It seems like it's a river, fish live in the river. So I'm a little confused as to that. Maybe you could explain to me what the current recognized uses are and why the fish aren't falling into that.
So Dr. Sildorf, who actually helped lead some of the research into what is actually happening in the estuary with aquatic life, I think is going to be a perfect one to take the first bite at answering that question, and then I can follow up. So
yeah. Thank you, Maya. So this goes back to 1967 when the estuary was literally a dead zone without oxygen, for 5 months every year. There was a compromise reached in 1967 where they said, we don't think we can get all the way back from a dead river to a fully thriving river where fish both are able to survive, adult fish are able to survive, and where they're going to be able to reproduce and their young are going to be able to reproduce. Part of that motivation in 1967 was, let's just allow fish like American shad to migrate through this corridor, and then their young fish in the fall to be able to migrate back out to the ocean without dying, right? So that in water quality standards language, they set the goal at maintenance, the word maintenance rather than maintenance and propagation, which is used in the Clean Water Act. And so this actually goes back to 1967 and how bad things were. And I think it was even ambitious back in 1967. They didn't know if they succeeded at even getting it to the maintenance level. But what we found is that we have actually achieved the maintenance, and that through that maintenance, there are a number of fish that have actually started to use the river. And so that's the existing use, that American shad now spawn in Philadelphia. Striped bass now spawn in Philadelphia and Camden, right off the old Navy Yard down by the Philadelphia airport and down to Wilmington. So these fish are actually using the river. The fish have come back for the good days when we don't have a bad DO summer. The estuary really is thriving, and that's where the DRBC has failed to recognize the fact that they exceeded their expectations from 1967, and we actually now have all of those fish in the estuary, and whether they're migratory fish or resident fish, they all are propagating, and it's just the regulatory agencies that are putting their heads in the sand and failing to recognize what is happening in the river. Despite their own studies, right? Their own studies demonstrate this, and still they say, well, we need to study it more.
And just so there is this very weird disconnect, as you said, Michael. This is a living, thriving river. This is where the fish live and procreate, right, and carry out their days. And so it does seem very odd that their full and fair use of this river is not being recognized and protected, right? And so that's the disconnect between reality and science and the way the laws are not just written, but are being implemented by the Delaware River Basin Commission, by the member states. And at this point, they're being allowed to slide by the Environmental Protection Agency even. So what we are saying is, the law requires you to recognize reality, to recognize the science, to recognize that use, that propagation use. And when you recognize that existing use, you then are obligated to protect it through the appropriate water quality standards. So it's making the law and the science come together. And DRBC has known about this fish propagation. When we did our 2013 petition to first raise this issue and seek this recognition and upgraded protection, we provided a wealth of science to prove the propagation was happening. And during the intermediate years from 2013 to 2021, DRBC has done and commissioned its own research. There's been more data by others to just fully lay to rest any question that the fish are fully utilizing this river, and that use needs to be recognized. And one of the species that Eric didn't mention, where really it is so critical and time sensitive, is that genetically unique population of Atlantic sturgeon. They actually need, they desperately need that 6.3 milligrams per liter of oxygen, or perhaps even higher. It was thought that our genetically unique population may have been lost to the river. But over a decade ago, I think it was around 2010, we actually have our first picture, right? A little bit before that time, scientists actually started to find that young of year of this genetically unique population were in fact in the Delaware Estuary, of course, signaling that they were propagating. Since that time, there's been a wealth of research to show that that propagation has been ongoing, but to also confirm that it is continuing at that minimum level, because we only have those 300 spawning adults left. And that in the good years when oxygen is high, we have more Atlantic sturgeon coming back and fully utilizing the river. And in those low years when dissolved oxygen is low, we are seeing conversely that the Atlantic sturgeon are not able to come back and fully use the river to support their life cycle. Given that they are so close to extinction, if the Delaware River Basin Commission does not act and does not act immediately, and or the member states, who could of course also do that on their own with the EPA, if they choose not to act and not to act immediately, we may be the generation responsible for wiping our genetically unique population of Atlantic sturgeon off of the face of this earth. That will be on us. That will be on the DRBC. And their research and our research is bearing that out. Frank, did you have a question?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I have a two-part question. So,
you're going in and out. You have to say it again.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm having problems with this computer that I'm using.
Do you want to put it in the chat, Frank? Are you able to put it in the chat and then I can read it for you? Because you're sort of ebbing and flowing.
Yes.
Okay. While Frank is putting that in the chat, there was just a question that had come in earlier from a reporter in advance. So I'm going to ask that to Caroline and Sonia in the first instance. You talked about very significant numbers, millions of dollars, but the question is, are these the maximum benefits that can be expected if there are dissolved oxygen improvements in the estuary?
By no means, no. We were very much limited by the availability of data specific to the Delaware Estuary region. And we focused it also by zone and subzone so we could look at the spatial distribution of those benefits. So we were able to look at commercial fishing for 3 species, for recreational fishing, and also for property values. But there are a number of other benefits that we could expect to be able to accrue to the region if we had additional data to estimate those. For example, we've got commercial landings of all the other dissolved oxygen sensitive species that are commercially caught within the region. And also there are a number of species that are reared within the estuary that are caught on the Atlantic coast. And so those have additional value to the estuary region as well, but we cannot account for those because we don't have that data. There's also the food value of the fish that are kept by recreational and subsistence anglers. We've got commercial property values that would be expected to increase with improved water quality. There's other recreational activities in addition to potential mental and physical health benefits that would accrue to people in the region from improved water quality and other activities that would occur. And then there's this whole category of what we call non-use values, which are the values that people have by knowing that the water quality is improved and the areas available and Atlantic sturgeon can continue to thrive. So there's a number of benefits that are above and beyond what we were able to estimate in this study.
And Eric, do you want to speak to the our selection of that moderate scenario as well?
Yes, so that is a good point. That we in the study actually modeled a full restoration scenario and a moderate restoration scenario. A full restoration meaning there would be no DO sag in the estuary again, but recognizing the challenge, we focused most of our analyses on the moderate restoration scenario, saying that we are not going to eliminate all wastewater discharges to the estuary, and so a 0.5 milligram per liter DO sag would still be expected. And so there would be additional economic benefits if we were able to, over the next decade or multiple decades, to actually fully restore oxygen in the estuary. So there's the estimates of total benefits are conservative from a number of perspectives. Yes.
And here, Frank put his questions in the chat. His first one is, it's my understanding a big part of the nitrogen load is from agriculture and lawn runoff. Can you speak to the proportion of nitrogen loads coming from point sources as opposed to non-point sources? In other words, will requiring wastewater treatment plants to upgrade really tackle the problem? Eric?
Yeah, really good question, and a really important distinction because nitrogen in this ecosystem both serves as food, just like carbon serves as food for microbial growth, and nitrogen serves as a nutrient for the growth of algae. We're not talking about total nitrogen loading. Total nitrogen loading is a problem, and that's something that we're going to have to address over the next 50 years in the estuary. Total nitrogen loading is probably 5 times higher than it was historically in the Delaware estuary. That's not the problem we're talking about right now. We're talking about nitrogen as food. So by discharging ammonia into the estuary, there are microbes, Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter are the two groups of microbes that actually see that ammonia as a food source, like our bodies would see, a wheat thin or a cracker, Ritz cracker as food. They're actually able to use that as their electron source. And so we are absolutely certain, Frank, that the nitrogen as food issue is coming probably 9/10 from the wastewater treatment plants discharging directly to the Delaware River. Those other sources of nitrogen from agricultural runoff, from other wastewater treatment plants further up in the watershed, from all of our use of our lawns and fertilizers in our gardens, those reach the Delaware estuary as nitrate, not as ammonia. And so those forms of nitrogen are nitrogen as a nutrient and are stimulating algal growth in the estuary. And that's a very complex issue that has not been adequately studied in terms of the eutrophication and the negative effects of that high nutrient loading on the estuary. We're actually talking about something, and that's what's so extraordinary, is we're talking about the issues that purportedly were solved back in the 1960s, 1970s with regulations such as DRBCs and regulations such as the Clean Water Act, where nitrogen is food, that again, nitrification, this conventional treatment plant process hasn't been implemented, whereas it has been implemented almost everywhere else in the country. And so we're kind of, back in the past, 50 years in the past, and dealing with that basic problem as ammonia as a reduced form of nitrogen. And because it's a reduced form of nitrogen, it actually can serve as microbial food and not just as a nutrient. It gets way into the weeds, and I'm happy to kind of dive into those weeds and explain it more. But let me stop there rather than going on for another 10 minutes.
And the second part of Frank's question, which I think is for Carolyn and Sonia, is I really don't understand the connection between property values and DO levels. Can you explain how one correlates to the other? And maybe you want to go first, and or maybe Eric would have a contribution as well.
Yeah. So if we're talking about water quality improvements, right, the Delaware River itself is generally pretty turbid. So most water quality studies are using like the Secchi disk reading for clarity to measure how housing prices increase with water quality improvements. So you can think of DO here as like a proxy for us saying, you know, water quality improvements would increase property values when they're sold. Does that help, Frank?
And it's based, Sonia, and Sonia and Carolyn can clarify that this is based not just on our own perceptions, but it's based on literature studies from the Portland, Oregon estuarine system, the Columbia River, and some of the tributaries there. So a similar urban and suburban combination of the specific property values that they were able to estimate with dissolved oxygen improvements there. So it's not speculation, it's actually based on published research.
But DO isn't the same as overall water quality, is it? Will that change turbidity?
You're right, Frank, that it isn't the only kind of perceived value of water quality, but it is a key part of that the dissolved oxygen has to do with the smells that you're getting from the river. And right, people that have grown up here and talk about the 60s and 70s, that people didn't even want to walk down to the river because the smells were so bad. But as you have higher oxygen levels, you don't get those off smells anymore. The perception of the water quality is better. You have more fish in the estuary, so the optics of the entire ecosystem are increased as you see, you know, in some of the other sturgeon rivers on the eastern seaboard, you actually see sturgeon breaching like whales. I have a bunch of sturgeon colleagues that have said they've seen this, and it kills me because I haven't seen it on the Delaware River, partly because our population is in such bad straits. But those are the kind of perceptions that as you increase oxygen, as you increase fish population, you no longer get those off experiences, and instead you're seeing this celebration, you know, fish, you know, literally, you know, blasting out of the river, and the property values are increasing with that perception that, yeah, this is a great place and I want to be part of that.
Great. One other question that came in previously was, do the benefits have to outweigh the costs of upgrades in order to advance the regulatory protections, the upgraded standards? And I'm going to go first and then turn it to Eric, but with a categorical no. In fact, the Clean Water Act is written specifically not to rely on this kind of cost benefit analysis, balancing assessment. Under the Clean Water Act, you have to protect the swimmable, fishable uses of a waterway. Under the Clean Water Act, if you have a demonstrated existing use, that use has to be recognized and it has to be protected. And what we are saying through our petition and what the scientific research has proven is that fish propagation in the Delaware estuary is an existing use. And so the regulatory agencies are obliged to recognize that use and protect it. And the way you protect it is through upgraded water quality standards and then enforcing those standards against those that should be complying but might be violating. So it's categorically, and that's one of the problems we hear is the Delaware River Basin Commission is joining with the industry, making that kind of false characterization, that false comparison. And it is just 100% wrong when it comes to how the law is supposed to operate. And in truth, that also, right, you know, Caroline and Sonia talked about the limitations of the research in terms of that economic valuation. We are not going to be able to capture all of the economic benefits in this kind of forward-looking analysis. We will experience them, we will capture them over time, we will prove them over time, but to force us into this false competition of cost versus cost is really it's legally wrong, but it's also morally wrong. The river belongs to the people. The people are entitled to the full, fair, best use of our river. We loan it to industry and dischargers to use in their operations, but they don't get to use it in a way that takes it from us, including, you know, the many ecological values that are so important to the people of the Delaware Estuary region. Eric, did you have something to add on to that?
Yeah, just very briefly, that this is actually a misnomer that has been perpetuated over the last 6 months, as some of these cost studies for improvements to the wastewater treatment plants have come up. And you've seen this at some of the Water Quality Advisory Committee meetings for the DRBC and other places, that they show a cost and a benefit curve, and others are saying that, well, it's where those two curves meet. And that is just a total misnomer. So it's a really good question. This isn't about trying to articulate benefits that exceed the costs. It's the benefit side of it is to articulate that there are costs to inaction and there are costs to our communities, and to provide the motivation for decision makers and policymakers and regulators to say, yeah, right, you as a wastewater treatment plant might say, hey, there's cost to me, how can you pass this cost on? But it's for them to say, yeah, but there are costs to all of us when you guys fail to act. It isn't a cost benefit calculation, despite the fact that that has been used at times. So an important distinction to make, yes.
John, do you want to ask your next two questions directly, or you want me to read your chat version?
Oh, I'll ask them. That's all right. So the first one is NBOD technology in use in any other urban rivers? And if so, what's the result?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's in use almost everywhere, John. So that's what's so striking, right? That I think one of the only places where they see similar problems with dissolved oxygen and high ammonia loading is actually in the San Francisco Bay Area and the estuary that goes up into the Central Valley. But they are investing in upgrades in those treatment plants because they know that they have problems with it. But in almost every other estuarine ecosystem, including, for instance, Long Island Sound or the Hudson Bay estuary, what they're talking about is the next phase of the evolution, right? So they've already implemented nitrification, and now, for instance, the Long Island Sound still has too much total nitrogen loading, going back to Frank's question about, point source and non-point source loading. So I think it's 3 wastewater treatment plants along the East River that New York City is literally scrapping all the way down to the ground and rebuilding from start at a cost of something like $3 to $5 billion to do nutrient removal. So in other estuaries, they're actually talking about the next phase in this whole evolution, because nitrification and NBOD treatment are so conventional and have been implemented so long ago. So where they are still seeing problems like Long Island Sound, they're going to the next level and actually doing nutrient removal, not just ammonia treatment.
So therefore, the Delaware estuary is really lagging the rest of the country. Is that what you're saying?
It is. So in EPA Region 3 that covers, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, this whole region, it is one of the only places that actually doesn't have Clean Water Act standards. That's right. That's how unique it is. It's one of the only places where it's only maintenance as the designated use rather than maintenance and propagation. So we literally lag 50 years behind almost everywhere else, both in the region and nationally.
That's why all that back patting by DRBC and others, oh, we're so great, we had this great success story, and now sitting on their haunches is so frustrating. Because yes, you were at the forefront at one time, but we're not now. So, did you want to ask your second question, John?
Oh, just a very quick thing. Yeah, I mean, why did dissolved oxygen levels decline during the summer?
Oh yeah, right. So yeah, that's a really good question, and that's kind of just fundamental water chemistry, that oxygen is one of these molecules that has greater solubility in colder water. And so this is part of the reason that trout do so well in cold water, is that you go to a cold water stream in the Poconos or the New Jersey Highlands, and because that water is colder, it is able to stuff more oxygen molecules in it. You'll see 10 milligrams per liter or 12 milligrams per liter even in summer. But as water warms, then it just can hold less oxygen. So saturation levels of oxygen in the Delaware estuary in the middle of summer would only be, say, 7 to 8 milligrams per liter. So it's naturally more difficult in summer just because of the chemistry and the oxygen saturation dynamics. And so that's when we see our problems. If you throw a 1 to 2 milligram per liter drag on the oxygen concentrations in the middle of winter, you might see it go from 12 to 11, right? Not a big deal. But if you're all the way down at 3 or 4 or 5 milligrams per liter and bring it down 1 to 2 milligrams per liter, you've gone from a satisfactory zone to a lethal zone. And so it's because of those natural dynamics with the warming water and the warm water not able to handle as much or dissolve as much oxygen, that a drag on dissolved oxygen goes to a critical level during summer months.
And so, of course, the climate crisis is going to make it worse. That's why we need to address it now. Michael, did you have another question?
Yeah, thanks. It's a simple question related to the petition to the DRBC, and kind of what comes next and what is the timeline for that? Is that something that the agency is required to act on in any way?
Well, so we have at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, we have used the petition process over the years to spur really important forward progress by the Delaware River Basin Commission, including the special protection waters protections, the original moratorium on fracking, and other things. But the DRBC goes to great pains to say that this is not a formal official process that requires them to respond. What we have demonstrated is that in the past, DRBC and the commissioners have chosen to be responsive, because these are real demonstration, these petitions, it's a real demonstration that the people are seeking action. And this is a mechanism that we can use to request that action and put forth all the facts and the science to make our case to the DRBC. And so we've submitted the petition. We went to the last commissioners meeting in March, and I and a number of our co-petitioners highlighted for the commissioners that this petition is before them and that we are urging action, that the last time they acted in 2013, it was unsatisfactory. They wanted more science. They got them more science. Now it's time for them to act. So really at this moment, the ball is in their court on the petition now, but when it comes to the Clean Water Act, the ball is in our court, because the Clean Water Act really does require our states to recognize existing uses and to protect those existing uses. So to the degree that the states have chosen, when there's sort of a common problem, to empower the DRBC to take that leadership role to address that problem on behalf of all of the impacted states, that's one of the reasons why we're turning to the Delaware River Basin Commission. But if the DRBC chooses not to act, that doesn't let the states and EPA off the hook. They're still on the hook when it comes to the Clean Water Act. And we have made very, very clear, we believe that they are violating their obligations under the Clean Water Act, their legal obligations, and that we therefore have the opportunity to bring a legal action to force compliance. And if we have to go to that step, we will. We are committed to doing that. We are hopeful, though, that because the science is so clear and the benefits of taking action are so clear on so many fronts, that the commissioners will finally be proactive and do the right thing. Recognize the existing use, upgrade the water quality standards, do it near term, and not continue to just kick the can down the road, which is what they've been doing. And they've been getting away with it too long. So we and our coalition partners, a number of our coalition partners, are already exploring that other pathway.
Do you have like a certain action you're looking for by a certain time before you decide to go to court?
So I can't tell you that there's a specific timeline right now. We've just submitted the petition a few weeks ago. We just highlighted it for the commissioners, made clear to them that this is a serious and important issue. Did that through the open public comment process that the DRBC currently has, we are now exploring that other pathway, because we are concerned about a lot of things on a lot of fronts, but in truth, particularly at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, where we have had a lot of actions and activities and efforts focused on saving our genetically unique population of Atlantic sturgeon, we are becoming desperately concerned that with the low oxygen levels that we've seen in recent years, particularly 2019 and 2020, with the warming temperatures due to the climate crisis, and with the inaction that we continue to see at the DRBC, we are very concerned that we may in fact be responsible for losing this genetically unique population of Atlantic sturgeon if we don't secure action now. So it is a priority for us at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and a number of our partners share our concerns. So we are prioritizing figuring that out But we do want to give the DRBC and the commissioners the opportunity to respond to the petition, to respond to this new kind of economic information we're providing, to push back on what they're hearing from the industry. And I do just want to highlight, and I think it was in the press release, we are anticipating a webinar, a Zoominar coming up in the next couple of weeks that will be open to the public, where we will make a more full, robust presentation of our petition, what it says, what the science says. This report will be brought into it, but really focusing on the full substance of that request and what it means for the DRBC not to act. So if there are not any other questions.
I think Frank had a question about whether Philadelphia is the biggest source of nitrogen. So I'm going to throw up a slide because this answers it and it puts it in context really well, Frank. The simple answer is yes. And in particular, this is a DRBC slide from Steve Tambini and Namsu Suk and a presentation they gave. And the black dots, so the blue line is the DO sag, and the black dots are the loading of ammonia. Again, ammonia is the principal component of the NBOD, of that nitrogen food. And you can see that in particular, literally 40% of that NBOD loading comes from one facility, which is Philadelphia's Southwest treatment plant down near the airport. And partly it's so high is because Philly sends its sludge from its 2 other wastewater treatment plants down to the Southwest plant for handling. And so when they spin off all of that concentrated waste in that sludge, they get extraordinarily high ammonia concentrations coming into the Southwest plant from that sludge handling. And so there's a reason why Philly Southwest is the biggest. But if you add the 3 Philly plants together, that's 40% and over 10% for the Northeast plant and nearly 10% for the Southeast plant, that over 50% and almost 60% of the total NBOD loading is coming from the city of Philadelphia. Yeah, so city of Philadelphia is a big part of the path forward. They're certainly not the other ones. Again, Wilmington is significant, Camden County is significant, Gloucester County is significant, and there are some other more moderate sized facilities like the Hamilton Township up in New Jersey and Lower Bucks here in Bucks County that are also significant in the upper part of the estuary. But certainly Philadelphia is the really big story.
Any other final questions? And of course, you can always follow up with us by phone. But really want to thank you so much for joining us, and looking forward to seeing the great stories on this important report. Thanks.